Hello and welcome to Social Studies class again. We are back. Hopefully you watched the video about three branches of government because that will help with your understanding today. So I suggest that if you have not watched that video to go back and watch that video first. Today we are going to be talking about a very sensitive topic, but it's a very important topic to understand in our forming of our government in American history, and that is slavery. And we're going to talk about how slavery was adapted into the Constitution of America. So, we're going to talk about slavery and the Constitution. So, a little background. We start with the Constitution itself. The purpose of the Constitutional Convention was to resolve problems with the Articles of Confederation. If you recall, before we had the Constitution, our first form of government was the Articles of Confederation, which was established after the American Revolution to be our form of government for the original 13 colonies. However, there was a lot of issues stemming from that, and a new constitution was deemed necessary. So the leaders from all 13 now states got together to draft a new constitution. This happened in Philadelphia in 1787, and it was called the Philadelphia Convention, and later would be called the Constitutional Convention. It's where the Constitution was drafted. And it was ratified 1 year later in 1788 and took effect another year later in 1789. One of the goals was to divide up lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Thanks to the Treaty of Paris, America was granted new lands. We saw that with our westward expansion as part of the Louisiana Purchase and other purchases and land conquerings. The U.S. was growing rapidly, and we wanted to figure out who would control these states, these new territories, and how would they be proportioned. And it was also to set up a democratic republic governmental system. So a democratic republic governmental system. What does that mean? Well, democracy is where we vote to elect our president and our lawmakers, like we saw in the other video. We have three branches of government, and we elect the representatives of two of those. We elect the President of the United States for the executive branch, and we elect our congressmen, so our representatives and our senators, in the executive branch. In the legislative branch. The executive branch is the president, and the legislative is our representatives and our senators. So our lawmakers and the person who's in charge of enforcing the laws, we elect. The judicial system is different. Those are appointed by the executive and approved by the legislative. But a democracy is a system of government where the people in that government vote for their representatives, and a republic means that people who are voted for democratically will make the laws and enforce the laws. So it's different than a kingdom or a queendom where there's a king or a queen who would rule. A monarchy, that's called a monarchy. A democratic republic is a government where the citizens vote for their representatives, and the representatives are the ones who actually make the laws and enforce the laws for us. So that's just the not so quick review of that. So at the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution was, as I said, written, and it's essentially a rule book for the American government. You may recall from the three branches of government, the judicial, one of the main responsibilities of the judicial branch or the Supreme Court and the judges is to make sure that all laws are constitutional. So even though we still come up with new laws, we find new ways to interpret laws, we are constantly referring back to this Constitution to make sure that we are staying true and we aren't going against the Constitution. That doesn't mean that we haven't changed the Constitution. And that's one thing we're going to see today is something that was in the Constitution when it was made, but that we've changed since, which would be, of course, slavery. Not all delegates liked the Constitution as it was written, so there was compromise that they built in. One was the Virginia Plan. This created the three branches of government that shared the power. They just fought the war against England. They separated themselves from a king and a monarchy. So they wanted to make sure that the new government of America did not become a monarchy and the president didn't become a king. So they wanted to make sure that all three branches of government had equal power. You see this little graphic up in the top right hand corner that shows how, I know it's hard to see, but if you zoom in, you can see how the three branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, they call it a balance of power. They have equal but different powers to make sure that not one of them is greater than the other. There's also what was called the Great Compromise, and this dealt with how states were represented in Congress. We saw that there's two different houses in the legislative branch or in Congress. There was a Senate, and every single state, no matter how large or small it is, when I say large or small, I mean by how much population there is, has an equal number of senators. All states have 2 senators. So there's 50 states, there's 100 senators in the Senate. However, a state's population determines how many representatives they have in the House of Representatives. So California and Texas and New York, for instance, have a lot more representatives in the House of Representatives than smaller states like Alaska, Hawaii, or Wyoming. And those were 2 of the compromises that were made, so that, because again, there was representatives from all the 13 colonies in the states and other territories actually who had different ideas of how the government should be. And one of the main differences that came into play was slavery. In the southern states, the southern colonies in the southern states, there was a lot more slavery than there was in the northern state. At this time, there was slavery in the northern states, but it was a lot more prevalent, meaning there was a lot more slavery in the southern states. There was a lot more farming and agriculture in those states, which required a lot more labor, and slavery, which, if you're not familiar with that, is the forced labor in servitude of other human beings. And thankfully now it's illegal, but at the time it was not. And the slaves were primarily from Africa. They were brought over on slaving ships from different countries, and they were bought and sold as property and as workers, and they were owned. They weren't free people. And again, we can see from this graph that the southern states had a lot more slaves compared to the northern states. And so the southern states wanted the slaves counted as part of their population, but they didn't want to have to pay taxes for their slaves. So they didn't want the slaves counted in the population when they had to pay their taxes, but they did want it for when they representation in the government. The northern states wanted slaves counted for the taxes. So again, all the economy that was the agricultural economy in the South, which was how they made most of their money, the North wanted them to be taxed according to how many slaves. An owner would be taxed for how many slaves they had, It would count as their property, but they did not want them to be represented as population when it came to the government. Why? And the question is, why do you think that was? Well, the southern states wanted them for representation so they had more power in government, there'd be more people, and since they owned the slaves, they could tell the slaves how to vote or what they wanted to do since they owned them. The northern states did not want this to happen because they knew that the slaves would just do as the slave masters and their owners would tell them to do. So we can see how it was written up in the Constitution originally. So in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, the compromise was made so that the North and South would agree to ratify the Constitution. The compromise was that each slave wouldn't count as a whole human being. They would count as 3/5 of a person. Now, I can already tell that that probably doesn't make sense to a lot of people, and I understand why. One is, how can you be a fraction of a human being? But what that meant was that for every 5 slaves, only 3 of their votes would count. And as far as towards the population of that state. And that would include for tax and representation. So that gave southern states a little bit more of representation in the government because they did tend to be lower population than the northern states. The northern states were more industrialized. There were bigger urban centers, so there's more cities. So there was more people compared to the southern states. So it allowed the southern states to have more representation in the government, but it also meant that they had to pay more taxes than if they couldn't claim any of the slaves as part of the population. However, it did mean that we were considering human beings at the time as being not a full person. Also, it was allowed within the Constitution, slavery and the slave trade, which allowed for humans, mainly again from Africa, to be brought over, to be bought, sold, traded, and that was all at the whim of, they were considered property, so whoever owned a slave was allowed to sell them. If you had enough money in a state that allowed it, you could buy slaves to be your servants and to be your workers. Article 1, Section 9 states that only the original 13 states could continue to import slaves, but only until 1808. So it put a timeline that after 1808, they were not going to bring in more slaves from other countries. One of the reasons for that was they didn't want more slaves brought in than the actual amount of free white people at the time. They didn't want the slaves to outnumber them. And it also says that any new state added in after the original 13 colonies and then 13 states, they would not be able to import any. That does not mean they couldn't have slaves. It just means they couldn't import them from other countries. The slaves that the new states would have to get would have to be bought and traded from one of the original 13 states. But you can see that the 2 sections allowed for slavery and for slave trading. Now we get to the establishment of free states, meaning that there aren't slavery allowed. In the Constitution, it was allowed that states could decide if they wanted to allow slavery or not. And we can see that most of the states in the North are going to make slavery illegal, and most of the states in the South are going to make slavery legal. But in the Constitution, in Article 4, Section 2, slaves that escaped to a free state must be returned to their owner, which meant that slaves were not allowed to, there was nowhere in America that they would be free. So even if you were a slave and you went to a state that slavery was not legal, you were still considered a slave, and you were still considered property of your owner, and you would have to be returned back to your owner if you tried to escape. Slavery was officially ended in 1865. That was with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't until, as you can see, over 80 years after the Constitution was ratified. It was made, and this was also the Civil War. And as we see with the Civil War, which is our next topic, the Civil War was mainly fought over the right to own slaves, or to make slaves officially illegal in all of the U.S. And because the North won, the South lost, slavery was made illegal in 1865 with the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation and with the 13th Amendment. As we talked about, the amendments were changes made to the Constitution, added after the Constitution was ratified, the 13th Amendment being the making slavery illegal. And we'll see with the 14th and 15th Amendments later on that those give all African Americans the right to vote and the right to be free and not ever have to be slaves in the U.S. Like I said, the 15th Amendment gave the African Americans the right to vote, and that was passed 5 years after slavery was made illegal. So there's 5 years in between 1865 and 1870 that even though they were no longer slaves, could no longer be slaves, African Americans still did not have the right to vote for 5 more years. So I know that was a long video, but I hope that you watched it all the way through. I'm going to ask you some questions in Google Classroom about the video to make sure that you watched it, because it is a very important topic in our history. It will come up a lot in our next unit, which is the unit on the Civil War. And as I said, it was the main reason that the Civil War was fought. And if you have any questions, like always, please email me or pop in at the office hours between 1:30 and 2:30 every day on Google Hangouts. And with that, I will see you next time.